Tonight we journey to the cradle of civilization itself, to a land where humanity first learned to write, to build cities that touched the heavens, and to organize society under written law. We travel to Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow through desert plains, bringing life to one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth. Here, in what is now southern Iraq, rose the greatest city of the ancient world, Babylon, whose very name has become synonymous with both magnificence and moral complexity. A place of legendary gardens and towering ziggurats, of wise kings and captive prophets, of astronomical knowledge and mathematical precision. The story of Babylon is layered with myth and history, so intertwined that separating them requires the patient work of archaeologists, sifting through millennia of sand and rubble, of linguists deciphering clay tablets written in wedge-shaped script, of historians comparing biblical accounts with Mesopotamian records and finding both convergence and contradiction. This city, destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across 2,000 years, left an imprint on human consciousness that survives long after its walls crumbled into dust. The land between the rivers does not offer its gifts freely. Unlike Egypt, where the Nile floods predictably each year, depositing rich soil along its banks, the Tigris and Euphrates are capricious, sometimes flooding too early or too late, sometimes not flooding enough, sometimes unleashing destructive torrents that sweep away everything in their path. Survival here required not just adaptation but innovation, not just responding to nature, but attempting to control it through irrigation canals, levees, and reservoirs. The effort to manage these rivers would shape the first complex societies, creating the need for coordinated labor, for record-keeping, for authority structures that could organize thousands of people toward common purpose. The Sumerians arrived first, or perhaps they were always there, their origins lost in prehistory. By 4000 BCE, they had established city-states throughout southern Mesopotamia, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, each centered on a temple complex dedicated to its patron deity, each competing with its neighbors for resources and prestige. These cities invented writing, not for poetry or history, but for the mundane necessity of tracking grain shipments and counting sheep. The cuneiform script they developed, pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, would evolve to record everything from business contracts to epic literature, from mathematical treatises to love letters. Babylon enters history modestly, just one city among many, located on the Euphrates in a strategic position that controlled trade routes between the northern and southern regions of Mesopotamia. The name itself, Babili in Akkadian, meant Gate of the Gods, suggesting the city's residents saw their home as a threshold between earthly and divine realms. Early Babylon served as a regional capital of minor importance, overshadowed by older, more established cities. But geography and ambition would eventually elevate it to supremacy. The first great king of Babylon was Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE. When he inherited the throne, Babylon controlled only a modest territory. Through a combination of military conquest, shrewd diplomacy, and patient opportunism, Hammurabi expanded his domain until it encompassed all of southern Mesopotamia. But his lasting fame rests not on his conquests, which were impressive but not unique, but on the law code he promulgated and had inscribed on stone steles erected throughout his kingdom. The Code of Hammurabi, discovered by French archaeologists in 1901 at the ancient city of Susa, stands nearly 8 feet tall, a black diorite monument covered with columns of cuneiform text. At its top, a relief carving shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and patron of justice, establishing divine sanction for the code's authority. The laws themselves, 282 of them, cover everything from property rights to family relations, from commercial transactions to criminal penalties. objective system. But in its historical context, Hammurabi's code represented a remarkable advancement. It established that justice should be predictable rather than arbitrary, that penalties should fit crimes rather than depending on the whims of local authorities, and that even the powerful were theoretically subject to law. The code distinguished between intentional and accidental harm, recognized different social classes with different rights and obligations, and attempted to protect the vulnerable, particularly widows and orphans, from exploitation. Not all provisions seem just by modern standards. Penalties varied dramatically based on social class, with harm done to nobles punished more severely than identical harm done to commoners. Some crimes carried death penalties that strike contemporary sensibilities as excessive. But the very existence of written law, publicly displayed and theoretically applicable to all, marked a significant step in human governance. Before Hammurabi, justice in most societies depended on custom, on the memory of elders, on the arbitrary decisions of rulers. After Hammurabi, the idea that law could be codified, known in advance, and applied consistently began to take root. Yet for all its historical importance, Hammurabi's Babylon did not long survive him. His empire fragmented after his death, and Babylon returned to being one city among many, sometimes independent, sometimes subject to foreign rulers. For over 1,000 years, the city endured conquest and occupation, its fortunes rising and falling with the tides of regional power struggles. The Kassites ruled it for centuries. The Assyrians conquered it repeatedly, and one Assyrian king, Sennacherib, destroyed the city so thoroughly in 689 BCE that he claimed to have diverted the Euphrates to flow over its ruins. But cities, like ideas, are difficult to kill completely. Babylon was rebuilt, and within a generation, it had regained much of its former prosperity. The pattern would repeat: destruction followed by reconstruction, foreign rule followed by reassertion of independence. The city persisted, not just as a physical place, but as an idea, as a symbol of civilization in a region prone to chaos, as a center of learning and culture that transcended any single dynasty or empire. Archaeological excavations, begun in earnest by German teams in the late 19th century and continuing episodically to this day, have revealed layers upon layers of occupation. Digging through Babylon is like reading a book written over and over on the same pages, each generation leaving its mark, each conquest adding debris, each reconstruction raising the ground level. The earliest layers are now far below the water table, inaccessible and probably lost forever. What remains accessible dates mostly from Babylon's final and greatest period of glory, the Neo-Babylonian Empire of the 6th century BCE. But before we reach that climactic chapter, it is worth pausing to consider what was lost. Most of what we know about Babylonian history comes from fragmentary sources, clay tablets preserved by chance, inscriptions carved in stone, accounts written by foreign observers who may have misunderstood what they saw. Whole libraries have vanished, their contents known to us only through later references. Kings whose reigns shaped their age survive as mere names in chronological lists. The daily lives of ordinary people, their hopes and fears, their joys and sorrows, are glimpsed only indirectly through legal documents and business records. Historians piece together this vanished world like detectives working a cold case, gathering clues, forming hypotheses, revising theories when new evidence emerges. Each archaeological season might uncover tablets that rewrite understanding of some aspect of Babylonian life. Each new translation might reveal connections previously unsuspected. The work is patient, painstaking, and never truly complete. Babylon, for all that has been learned, remains in many ways mysterious. A city known more through legend and imagination than through hard evidence. The rivers continue to flow. though their courses have shifted over millennia. The land between them, once so fertile that it supported the world's first urban civilization, has been exhausted by centuries of irrigation that raised salt levels in the soil, by warfare that destroyed canal systems, by climate changes that reduced rainfall. Where once stood cities, now there are tells, artificial hills created by generations of mud brick buildings collapsing and being rebuilt on top of their own ruins. Wind carries dust across landscapes that once teemed with life, and the casual observer might never guess that here, in this harsh and empty terrain, humanity first learned to be civilized. But beneath the dust lie the foundations. Beneath the tells rest the tablets. And in museums and universities around the world, scholars continue the work of resurrection, bringing ancient voices back to life, one cuneiform sign at a time, reconstructing a world that shaped our own in ways we are only beginning to understand. In the year 626 BCE, as Assyrian power weakened under the weight of its own overextension and the pressure of emerging rivals, a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar seized control of Babylon and declared independence. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for centuries with brutal efficiency, was collapsing. Nabopolassar allied with the Medes, a people from the Iranian plateau, and together they systematically dismantled Assyrian power. By 612 BC, the great Assyrian capital lay in ruins, destroyed so completely that its location would be lost for over 2,000 years. From the ashes of the Assyrians' collapse emerged the Neo-Babylonian Empire, sometimes called the Chaldean Empire, which would dominate the region for less than a century, but would leave a mark on history far exceeding its brief duration. This was Babylon's golden age, when the city would be rebuilt on a scale that dwarfed all previous versions, when its name would become synonymous with luxury and power, when its influence would extend from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Nabopolassar began the reconstruction, but it was his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who would transform Babylon into the wonder that ancient writers described with awe and that biblical prophets denounced with fury. Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne in 605 BCE, inheriting an empire and immediately setting about securing and expanding it. His military campaigns brought the Levant under Babylonian control, including the Kingdom of Judah, whose repeated rebellions would have consequences that echoed through religious history. But Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a conqueror. He was a builder on a scale that few rulers in history have matched. The Babylon he created was designed not just for defense or administration, but for majesty, to inspire awe in visitors and pride in residents, to demonstrate that Babylonian civilization had reached heights no other nation could match. The city that emerged from his ambitious building program would span over 3 square miles, protected by massive double walls that ancient writers claimed were so thick that chariots could race along their tops. The outer wall, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon about a century after Nebuchadnezzar's death, was nearly 90 feet high and extended for over 10 miles in circumference. Modern archaeology suggests Herodotus may have exaggerated the dimensions, but even conservative estimates indicate defenses at extraordinary scale. The walls were studded with towers at regular intervals, providing platforms for defenders and creating a fortress-like appearance that announced Babylon's power to anyone approaching. 8 gates pierced the walls, each dedicated to a deity and decorated with elaborate tilework. But one gate stood above all others in splendor, the Ishtar Gate, named for the goddess of love and war, covered in brilliant blue glazed bricks and adorned with relief sculptures of bulls and dragons. the sacred animals of the storm god Adad and the city god Marduk. The gate opened onto the processional way, a broad street paved with limestone and bordered by walls decorated with 120 lions, also in glazed brick relief, striding along the route in protective majesty. This processional route led directly to the heart of the city, to the massive ziggurat known as Edamananki, the foundation of heaven and earth. This was the temple of Marduk, chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, a stepped tower that rose in 7 diminishing tiers to a height that ancient sources suggest may have reached 300 feet, though again, archaeological evidence suggests somewhat more modest dimensions. At its summit stood a shrine where, according to Babylonian belief, Marduk dwelt and could be consulted by his priests. The Greeks, encountering descriptions of this structure, identified it as the Tower of Babel from Hebrew scripture, the hubristic construction that God had supposedly destroyed by confusing human languages. Whether or not Edamananki was the specific tower that inspired the biblical story is debated by scholars. But the connection between Babylon's famous ziggurat and the Genesis account is deeply embedded in Western consciousness. The very word Babel, meaning confused noise, derives from this association, though ironically, Babel is simply the Hebrew form of Babylon, which meant Gate of God in Akkadian. Near the ziggurat stood the great temple complex of Marduk Ezechila, containing not just religious chambers, but treasuries filled with tribute from across the empire. Workshops where craftsmen created elaborate ritual objects, and administrative offices from which priests managed extensive agricultural holdings. Religion in Babylon was not separate from economics or politics, but thoroughly integrated with both. The temples were major landowners and employers, and the priests wielded considerable influence in civic affairs. Nebuchadnezzar's palace complex, located near the Ishtar Gate, was designed to match the temples in magnificence. The throne room, excavated by German archaeologists in the early 20th century, retained enough of its original decoration to reveal the splendor of its appearance. Walls covered in glazed brick panels showing stylized palm trees, columns and geometric patterns in blues, yellows, and whites. Here Nebuchadnezzar held court, received ambassadors, and administered an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. But perhaps no feature of Nebuchadnezzar's, Babylon has captured imagination more persistently than the Hanging Gardens, counted by Greek writers among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to these accounts, the gardens were built as a gift for Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Amytis, a Median princess who missed the green hills and lush vegetation of her homeland and found the flat, arid Mesopotamian plain depressing. To please her, the king supposedly constructed an artificial mountain, terraced gardens rising in tiers, and fed by water drawn from the Euphrates through an ingenious system of pumps and channels. The descriptions are vivid and detailed. Ancient writers spoke of great trees growing at considerable height, of flowers and shrubs from many lands cultivated in imported soil, of cool grottos and fountains that created a paradise in the midst of the desert city. The engineering required would have been remarkable, waterproofing the terraces to prevent water from rotting the supporting beams, lifting water to significant heights without the benefit of modern pumps, maintaining the delicate balance of moisture needed to keep plants alive in Babylon's harsh climate. There is only one problem. No archaeological evidence for the Hanging Gardens has ever been found in Babylon. German excavators searched extensively and found nothing that could be identified as the foundation for such a structure. No Babylonian text mentions them. Nebuchadnezzar, who left numerous inscriptions detailing his building projects, never once referred to gardens among his achievements. The silence from Babylonian sources is deafening and troubling. Several theories attempt to explain this mystery. Some scholars suggest the gardens existed, but were located outside the excavated areas, or were destroyed so completely that no trace remains. Others propose they were actually built in Nineveh by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who did leave inscriptions describing elaborate palace gardens with sophisticated irrigation systems, and that Greek writers confused the two Mesopotamian cities. Still others suggest the Hanging Gardens are entirely legendary, a Greek fantasy projected onto Babylon based on travelers' tales and misunderstood descriptions of the city's actual gardens and parks. The question remains unresolved, another of Babylon's mysteries. Perhaps future excavations will uncover evidence that settles the matter. Perhaps the gardens are gone beyond recovery. Or perhaps they never existed, except in imagination, which would not make them less significant as cultural artifacts, as expressions of what ancient peoples believed possible, as symbols of human ambition to transform nature into art. What is certain is that Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was extraordinary by any measure. The city supported a population estimated at 200,000, enormous for the ancient world. Its markets drew traders from across the known world. Its schools, attached to temples, taught scribes to read and write cuneiform, to calculate complex mathematical problems, to observe and predict celestial phenomena with remarkable accuracy. Babylonian astronomers tracked the movements of planets with such precision that their observations would be used by Greek and Islamic astronomers over 1,000 years later. The city's reputation spread far beyond its physical boundaries. To the Greeks, Babylon represented the mysterious and exotic East, a place of wonders and wealth. To the Hebrews, it represented both captivity and temptation, the foreign power that had destroyed Jerusalem and exiled the Jewish elite, but also a sophisticated civilization whose achievements could not be entirely dismissed even by those who resented its dominance. This dual nature of Babylon's legacy, as both magnificent and morally complex, would shape how Western civilization remembered the city for millennia to come. It was the golden city and the whore of Babylon, the wonder of the world and the symbol of prideful overreach. Understanding this complicated legacy requires examining the event that more than any other connected Babylon to biblical tradition, the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. In 597 BCE, King Jehoiakim of Judah made a decision that would prove catastrophic for his kingdom. Despite being a vassal of Babylon, despite having sworn loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar, he allied with Egypt and rebelled against Babylonian authority. The rebellion was brief. Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and overwhelming. Jerusalem fell after a short siege, and the Babylonian king carried off Jehoiakim, along with thousands of Judah's elite, nobles, priests, craftsmen, anyone whose skills or status made them valuable. This was standard imperial practice in the ancient Near East. Deportation served multiple purposes. It removed potential leadership for future rebellions. It transferred useful skills to the imperial center, and it demonstrated the conqueror's power in a way that mere tribute could not. The deportees were not enslaved in the traditional sense. They were resettled in Babylonia, given land to cultivate or integrated into the urban economy, allowed to maintain their religious and cultural practices, but kept under supervision and forbidden to return home. Nebuchadnezzar placed Jehoiachin's uncle Zedekiah on Jerusalem's throne as a puppet king. But within a decade, Zedekiah also rebelled, again encouraged by Egypt. This time Nebuchadnezzar's patience was exhausted. The siege of Jerusalem lasted over 2 years, reducing the city to starvation. When the walls were finally breached in 586 BCE, the consequences were severe. The city was systematically destroyed. Solomon's temple, the center of Jewish worship, was torn down and burned. Its sacred vessels were carried off to Babylon. The palace was demolished. The walls were pulled down. A second, larger wave of deportations followed, leaving Judah largely depopulated and Jerusalem in ruins. The Babylonian captivity, as this period came to be known, lasted approximately 70 years and had a profound effect on Jewish religion and identity. The loss of the temple, the central place of sacrifice, and the physical dwelling place of God created a theological crisis. How could they worship Yahweh in a foreign land? How should they understand their defeat? Was their God less powerful than the gods of Babylon, or had their own sins brought this punishment upon them? The prophets who had been deported, along with the people, provided answers. Ezekiel, prophesying among the exiles by the rivers of Babylon, assured them that God had not abandoned them, that their suffering was indeed punishment for unfaithfulness, but that restoration was possible through repentance. Jeremiah, who had remained in Judah, sent letters urging the exiles to settle in, build houses, plant gardens, and pray for the peace of Babylon, for in its peace they would find peace. The message was not one of imminent return, but of patient endurance and spiritual renewal. Daniel, whether historical figure or legendary character, his status remains debated among scholars, represented another response to exile. The stories told about him in the biblical book bearing his name show a Jew rising to high position in the Babylonian and later Persian courts while maintaining strict observance of Jewish law. He interprets dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, survives being thrown into a den of lions, and receives visions of future empires. The Tales emphasize that faithfulness to God can be maintained even under foreign rule, that Jewish identity does not depend on living in the land of Israel. From the Babylonian perspective, preserved in cuneiform records, the Jewish exiles were merely one group among many displaced peoples in the empire. Administrative tablets mention rations distributed to Jachin, king of Judah, confirming the biblical account that Jehoiachin lived in Babylon and received provisions from the royal household. Other texts mention Jewish names, showing that at least some exiles integrated into Babylonian economic life, working as merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. Some clearly prospered, as evidenced by the fact that when Cyrus the Persian later permitted their return to Judah, many chose to remain in Babylonia, where they had established successful lives. The experience of exile transformed Judaism in ways that would prove lasting. Without a temple, religious practice shifted toward prayer, scriptural study, and community gatherings in what would eventually evolve into the synagogue. Without a land, Jewish identity became less tied to geography and more focused on law, tradition, and collective memory. The texts that would form the Hebrew Bible began to be compiled and edited during this period, as scribes gathered disparate traditions into coherent narratives that explained Jewish history and reinforced group identity. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled many centuries later, would preserve Babylonian Jewish scholarship and become one of the two great works of rabbinic literature. Even after Jerusalem was rebuilt and the temple restored, Babylonia remained a major center of Jewish learning for over 1,000 years, until the Islamic conquests shifted the centers of Jewish life once again. But what of Nebuchadnezzar himself, the great king whose conquests brought the Jews to Babylon? Biblical accounts present him as the instrument of God's punishment, powerful but ultimately humbled. The book of Daniel tells a story of the king going mad, driven from human society to live like an animal eating grass, only recovering his sanity when he acknowledged the Hebrew God's supremacy. No Babylonian source mentions such an episode, leading most historians to view it as theological narrative rather than historical record. A story told to make a point about divine sovereignty rather than to document actual events. What Babylonian records do show is a king intensely focused on building projects, on strengthening defenses, on ensuring proper religious observances, on maintaining the irrigation systems that kept the agricultural base productive. His inscriptions emphasize his role as the restorer of temples, the rebuilder of walls, the provider for his people. He ruled for 43 years, an extraordinarily long reign for the ancient world, suggesting competent administration and at least general political stability. Yet there are hints of something unusual in his later years. A fragmentary text mentions that Nebuchadnezzar's son, Amel-Marduk, released the king of Judah from prison after Nebuchadnezzar's death, which aligns with biblical accounts. Other texts suggest possible co-regency arrangements in Nebuchadnezzar's final years, which sometimes indicated a king's declining capacity. Whether this reflects the episode of madness described in Daniel, or simply the normal succession planning of an aging monarch, remains impossible to determine with certainty. The king who had seemed invincible died around 562 BCE. His death marked the beginning of Babylon's decline, though the city's end would not come for another quarter century. His son Amel-Marduk ruled only 2 years before being assassinated by his brother-in-law. The throne then passed to several short-lived rulers before falling to Nabonidus, a figure whose reign would be marked by religious controversy, and whose absence from Babylon at a crucial moment would facilitate the city's fall. Nabonidus was not of the royal line. He came to power through a combination of court intrigue and support from the priesthood. But his actions, once crowned, puzzled and alarmed his subjects. He devoted extraordinary attention to the moon god Sin rather than to Marduk, Babylon's traditional chief deity. He spent years away from Babylon, residing in the Arabian oasis of Tema for reasons that remain unclear. Some texts suggest he was mentally unstable. Others indicate religious motivations for his actions. The confusion in ancient sources reflects genuine uncertainty about what drove this unusual king. During Nabonidus's absence, his son Belshazzar served as co-regent in Babylon. This Belshazzar appears in the biblical Book of Daniel as the king who saw mysterious writing appear on a wall during a feast. Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, interpreted by Daniel to mean that Belshazzar had been weighed and found wanting, that his kingdom would be divided between the Medes and Persians. That very night, according to the biblical account, Belshazzar was slain, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom. The historical reality was less dramatic, but more complex. By the 540s BCE, a new power was rising to the east, the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus had conquered the Medes, defeated Lydia in Asia Minor, and was systematically absorbing the remnants of older Near Eastern states into his expanding empire. Babylon, weakened by internal divisions, and Nabonidus's unpopular policies, stood in his path. The confrontation came in 539 BCE. Cyrus's forces defeated the Babylonian army at Opis on the Tigris. Then, in an event that shocked contemporaries, Babylon itself fell without significant resistance. The Persian account, preserved in the Cyrus Cylinder, claims the king entered the city peacefully, welcomed by priests and people who were dissatisfied with Nabonidus. The Hebrew Bible attributes the peaceful transfer of power to divine intervention on behalf of the Jewish exiles. Babylonian sources are largely silent or fragmentary, leaving the exact circumstances unclear. What is certain is that Babylon's days as an independent power were over. The city would remain important, serving as one of the administrative centers of the Persian Empire, but it would never again be the capital of its own empire. The Neo-Babylonian period, that brief but brilliant flowering that had begun with Nabopolassar less than a century earlier, had ended not with apocalyptic destruction, but with a whimper, with gates open to a conqueror who promised continuity rather than upheaval. While political power shifted to Persian Susa and later to other capitals, Babylon retained its reputation as a center of learning and culture. The city's scholars had accumulated knowledge over millennia, preserved on clay tablets in libraries attached to temples and palaces. This knowledge encompassed astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, literature, and religion, representing one of humanity's first systematic attempts to understand and document the world. Babylonian astronomy was particularly sophisticated. Observers had tracked the movements of celestial bodies for centuries, recording their findings on tablets that noted planetary positions, lunar phases, eclipses, and other phenomena. This data allowed Babylonian astronomers to develop predictive models of surprising accuracy. They calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of the true value. They predicted lunar eclipses with remarkable precision. They identified the planets visible to the naked eye and tracked their movements against the background of fixed stars. This astronomical work was motivated partly by practical concerns. The Babylonian calendar was lunar, requiring periodic adjustments to keep it aligned with the solar year and the agricultural seasons. Predicting eclipses had religious significance, as these were considered omens requiring interpretation and possibly ritual responses. But the work went beyond immediate utility. Babylonian astronomers were engaged in something approaching pure science, documenting patterns simply to understand them, building models to explain what they observed. Greek astronomers would later build on this Babylonian foundation. Ptolemy, working in Alexandria centuries after Babylon's fall, still relied on Babylonian observational data. The Babylonian division of the circle into 360 degrees, of the hour into 60 minutes, of the minute into 60 seconds, survives in modern timekeeping and geometry. The zodiac, that band of constellations through which the sun appears to move over the course of a year, was systematized by Babylonian astronomers. Even the 7-day week, with each day named for a celestial body, reflects Babylonian astronomical observations filtered through later cultural development. Mathematics flourished alongside astronomy. Babylonian mathematicians worked with a sophisticated place-value number system based on 60, which made complex calculations possible. They solved quadratic equations, calculated square roots and cube roots, and developed geometric techniques for measuring areas and volumes. Clay tablets survive showing mathematical problems and their solutions. Apparently used for teaching successive generations of scribes the numerical skills needed for administration and commerce. One famous tablet, known as Plimpton 322, contains what appears to be a table of Pythagorean triples, combinations of three numbers that can form the sides of right triangles. This tablet predates Pythagoras by over 1,000 years, suggesting that the theorem attributed to him was known much earlier to Babylonian mathematicians. Whether they understood it as a general principle or merely as a useful practical relationship remains debated among historians of mathematics. Medicine in Babylon combined empirical observation with religious concepts of disease causation. Diagnostic texts describe symptoms with remarkable precision, distinguishing between different types of ailments and suggesting treatments. Some treatments were purely pharmaceutical, using herbs and minerals whose medicinal properties had been discovered through trial and error. Others involved ritual elements, invoking gods or warding off demons thought to cause illness. The mixture of natural and supernatural approaches seems contradictory to modern minds, but it reflected a worldview that did not sharply separate these domains. The Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, discovered by 19th century archaeologists, contained thousands of tablets collected from Babylon and other Mesopotamian cities. Among them were medical texts, astronomical observations, mathematical treatises, and literary works including the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest known epic poem. When British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard shipped these tablets to the British Museum in the 1850s, they opened a window into Mesopotamian intellectual life that had been closed for over 2 millennia. Deciphering cuneiform script was itself a scholarly achievement of the first order. The script had been extinct for nearly 2,000 years when modern scholars began attempting to read it. The breakthrough came through the Behistun inscription, a trilingual text carved into a cliff face in Persia by Darius the Great, written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. By comparing the three versions, scholars gradually cracked the code, and Mesopotamian civilization began to speak again. What emerged from these tablets was a picture of sophisticated, urban societies with complex bureaucracies, extensive trade networks, and rich cultural lives. Legal documents revealed property transactions, marriage contracts, and court cases that showed how ordinary people navigated the systems governing their lives. Letters between merchants documented trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. School texts showed how scribes were trained, starting with simple signs and progressing to complex literary compositions. Religious texts revealed a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with specific domains and personalities, and a mythology that explained the creation of the world, the origin of humanity, and the relationship between mortals and immortals. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes how Marduk defeated the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat, and from her body created the heavens and earth. Some scholars see echoes of this in the Genesis creation account, suggesting cultural exchange between Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions, though the extent of influence remains debated. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a king's quest for immortality and his ultimate acceptance of human mortality. The story includes a flood narrative with striking similarities to the biblical flood. A man warned by a god builds a boat, saves his family and animals. The flood destroys all other life. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are sent out to find dry land. The parallels are too close to be coincidental, indicating either a common tradition or direct borrowing, though which direction the influence ran and when it occurred remain matters of scholarly discussion. Literature in Babylon was not merely religious or mythological. Love poetry survives, expressing desire and longing in language that remains affecting across the millennia. Proverbs and wisdom texts offered practical advice and philosophical observations. Laments mourned destroyed cities and lost loved ones. The range and sophistication of this literature challenges any simplistic notion of ancient peoples as primitive or unsophisticated. Yet for all its achievements, Babylonian civilization never developed certain innovations that would prove crucial elsewhere. The alphabet, which made writing accessible by reducing the number of symbols from hundreds to dozens, was invented by Phoenicians, not Mesopotamians. Democracy, even in limited form, did not emerge in Babylonian political systems, which remained monarchical and hierarchical. Philosophical inquiry, though present in religious and wisdom texts, did not develop the systematic character it would achieve in Greece. The physical city crumbled, but Babylon's reputation survived, transmitted through biblical texts, classical literature, and the persistent human tendency to mythologize the past. In Jewish and Christian tradition, Babylon became a symbol of worldly power opposed to divine authority, of magnificent civilization marred by moral corruption, of humanity's prideful attempt to reach heaven through its own efforts. The Tower of Babel story encapsulated these themes, presenting technological achievement as spiritual danger when divorced from proper humility. The Book of Revelation, written in the late 1st century CE, when Rome dominated the Mediterranean, used Babylon as a code name for imperial power, calling it Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and abominations of the earth. This rhetorical strategy allowed the author to critique Roman authority while maintaining plausible deniability. But it also cemented Babylon's association with vice and oppression in Christian imagination. For centuries, Babylonian would be shorthand for decadent, corrupt, tyrannical. Yet this negative reputation coexisted with recognition of Babylon's achievements. Medieval Islamic scholars, working in the same Mesopotamian region where Babylon had once stood, studied Greek texts that preserved Babylonian astronomical and mathematical knowledge. They built upon these foundations, developing algebra, refining astronomical observations, and transmitting this knowledge to medieval Europe, where it would contribute to the scientific revolution. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical antiquity, including the Near Eastern civilizations that had preceded Greece and Rome. But without the ability to read cuneiform, European scholars depended on biblical and classical accounts, which presented a limited and biased picture. Babylon remained more legend than history, a name evoking splendor and sin in roughly equal measure. The 19th century changed everything. As European powers expanded into the Middle East, archaeologists followed, drawn by the possibility of recovering the physical remains of biblical civilizations. When French and British excavators began digging at sites in Mesopotamia, they discovered not just artifacts, but texts, thousands of clay tablets that promised to reveal how these ancient peoples understood themselves, not filtered through Greek or biblical perspectives, but in their own words. The German excavations at Babylon, led by Robert Koldewey from 1899 to 1917, were particularly significant. Koldewey and his team uncovered the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and the foundations of the Great Ziggurat. They found tablets documenting daily life, administration, and religion. They mapped the city's layout, revealing its enormous size and sophisticated urban planning. Babylon ceased to be merely legendary and became archaeological, something that could be measured, photographed, and studied scientifically. The Ishtar Gate, reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin from original glazed bricks, gives visitors a sense of the gate's original splendor. The brilliant blue tiles, the relief sculptures of striding animals, the sheer scale of the construction, all testify to the ambition and skill of Nebuchadnezzar's builders. Standing before it, one can almost imagine the processions that once passed through. Priests carrying sacred images, soldiers returning victorious from campaign, diplomats from distant lands arriving to pay homage. Yet the gate in Berlin is in some ways a problematic object. The bricks are original, excavated from Babylon and shipped to Germany, but they have been reassembled in a museum far from their original context. This raises questions about cultural heritage, about who has the right to possess and display artifacts from ancient civilizations, about the tension between preserving objects for study and display versus leaving them in their countries of origin. These debates continue, with Iraq seeking the return of artifacts, while museums argue that Dispersing cultural heritage provides better protection and wider access. The 20th century brought new challenges to Babylon's remains. The site, located in modern Iraq near the city of Hilla, suffered from inadequate protection and occasional deliberate damage. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein, seeking to associate himself with ancient Mesopotamian glory, initiated a controversial reconstruction project that involved building new structures on top of ancient foundations, using modern materials clearly distinguishable from the original mud brick, but nonetheless altering the archaeological site in ways many experts found problematic. The 2003 invasion of Iraq and subsequent occupation brought military forces to Babylon. A Polish-led coalition established a military camp on the site, and American forces used the area as well. Heavy vehicles damaged ancient paving stones. Trenches were dug through archaeological deposits. The site suffered more degradation in a few years than it had in decades, drawing protests from archaeologists worldwide. Since then, efforts have been made to assess and repair the damage, but some losses are irreversible. In 2019, UNESCO designated Babylon a World Heritage Site, recognizing its outstanding universal value and committing to its protection. The designation offers some hope that the remains will be better preserved for future generations. But challenges remain: political instability in the region, limited funding for conservation, the ongoing tension between archaeological preservation and local development needs. For contemporary Iraq, Babylon represents both pride and complexity. It is a reminder of a time when Mesopotamia stood at the center of civilization, when Baghdad and Babylon were names that commanded respect across the known world. But it also predates Islam, the religion of the vast majority of Iraqis, and connects more directly to pre-Islamic traditions. How to honor this heritage while remaining faithful to Islamic identity is a question Iraqi scholars and cultural leaders continue to negotiate. The legacy of Babylon extends beyond archaeology and cultural heritage into language and imagination. Babylonian appears in contexts far removed from ancient Mesopotamia. The term describes confusion, a babel of voices, captivity by the rivers of Babylon, and urban complexity, modern Babylon. These uses often carry moral judgments, positive or negative, that say more about those employing the terms than about the historical city. In popular culture, Babylon appears in films, novels, and games, usually as a setting of exotic splendor, sometimes as a fallen civilization serving as cautionary tale. These depictions rarely engage seriously with historical reality, preferring the mythologized version that serves narrative or thematic purposes. The hanging gardens bloom in these fictions, regardless of archaeological doubt. Nebuchadnezzar goes mad, Daniel interprets dreams, and the tower rises toward heaven, all because these stories have become part of how Western culture imagines the ancient world. What would the ancient Babylonians make of this legacy? They could not have imagined that their city would be remembered millennia after its abandonment, though they certainly hoped for immortality through their monuments and inscriptions. They could not have guessed that their astronomical observations would contribute to modern science, that their mathematical innovations would still be taught to school children, that their legal concepts would influence jurisprudence across civilizations. But perhaps they would recognize something familiar in the human tendency to build, to reach towards something greater than ourselves, to attempt through architecture and art and knowledge to transcend our mortality. The ziggurats rose not because they were practically necessary, but because humans wanted to create something magnificent, to honor their gods, to demonstrate what civilization could achieve. That impulse has not changed. We still build towers, still reach for the heavens, still try to leave something behind that will outlast our brief lives. The desert wind blows across the ruins as it has for centuries, carrying dust and sand, slowly erasing what remains. The Euphrates flows nearby, though not in the channel where it once nourished the city. A few scattered stones mark where the Ishtar gate stood before its bricks were removed. The foundation of Etemenanke, that tower that reached toward the gods, lies beneath accumulated debris and groundwater. Tourists visit sometimes, though political instability makes travel to the region uncertain. Archaeologists continue their patient work when circumstances permit, each season revealing a little more, answering some questions while raising others. Babylon endures not in mud brick and tile, not in walls and towers that have long since crumbled, but in memory and influence. It endures in the astronomical knowledge preserved and built upon by later civilizations. It endures in legal concepts that traveled from Hammurabi's code through Roman law into modern jurisprudence. It endures in mathematical techniques still taught and used. It endures in the alphabet's indirect descent from cuneiform through various intermediate scripts. It endures in religious traditions that were shaped by the experience of exile and by reaction against Babylonian culture. Most of all, it endures as an idea, as a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, that what seems eternal is temporary, that human achievement is both magnificent and fragile. The greatest city of the ancient world is dust and ruins, yet its name remains known to millions who could not locate it on a map. That paradox, that a city so thoroughly destroyed could leave such a lasting imprint, speaks to something fundamental about human culture, about our need for stories that explain where we came from and warn us about where we might be heading. The journey through Babylon's history, from its modest beginnings as a Mesopotamian city-state to its brief period of imperial glory and its long decline into legend and archaeology, reveals patterns that recur throughout human civilization. Empires rise when circumstances favor them, when leaders of unusual ability emerge, when military innovations provide advantages, when economic and demographic factors align. They fall when these factors reverse, when leadership falters, when enemies adapt, when resources become scarce or mismanaged, when the sheer complexity of maintaining far-flung territories exceeds the administrative capacity to manage them. Babylon's story is not unique in this regard. Egypt rose and fell multiple times. Rome's Western Empire collapsed while its Eastern incarnation persisted for another 1,000 years. The Mongol Empire, the largest land empire ever assembled, fragmented within a century. The Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, all followed similar trajectories. The specific details differ, but the pattern holds: creation, expansion, peak, decline, transformation, or disappearance. What made Babylon distinctive was not the pattern of its imperial career, but the depth of its cultural achievements and the persistence of its reputation. Many empires have come and gone, leaving barely a trace. Babylon left cuneiform tablets that preserved knowledge, architectural innovations that inspired later builders, and stories that embedded themselves so deeply in Western consciousness that they remain part of our imaginative landscape millennia after the city's abandonment. The question of what we should learn from Babylon admits no simple answer. That all things pass? True, but perhaps not particularly useful. Babylon was neither the paradise of legend nor the den of vice that biblical tradition sometimes suggests. It was a human city, remarkable in its achievements, typical in its flaws, home to people who worried about crops and commerce, who prayed to their gods for help and protection, who told stories to their children, who fell in love and grew old and died like humans everywhere. They happened to live in one of history's most significant cities during one of its most influential periods. And through accident and effort, enough of their legacy survived to teach us something about both them and ourselves. Each excavation season, each deciphered tablet, each newly understood connection between texts or artifacts adds to our knowledge. The work is slow, painstaking, often frustrating. Funding is uncertain, political conditions unpredictable, preservation challenges overwhelming. But the work continues because Babylon matters, not just as history but as heritage, as part of the human story that we are still learning to tell. The city that was the gate of the gods is gone. The ziggurats have fallen. The walls are breached beyond repair. The hanging gardens, if they existed, exist no longer. But Babylon itself, as an idea, as a symbol, as a chapter in human civilization's long book, remains. It speaks to us still, across the millennia, telling stories of ambition and achievement, of pride and fall, of the eternal human desire to build something that will outlast our mortal span. And in the quiet moments, when the wind stills and the dust settles, when archaeologists brush ancient clay with infinite care, when scholars puzzle over damaged texts, when visitors stand among ruins trying to imagine the life that once filled these spaces, Babylon lives again, briefly, imperfectly, but genuinely, reminding us of who we were and who we might yet become. Asterisk, that's all for tonight. Sleep well.